So Ralph, when did you first realize that you actually wanted to work on a science problem that was in some ways so parallel to what your dad had done?
Hard to say exactly, but I did start talking with my father about his science when I was an undergraduate, and developed more appreciation for it and understanding of it. And I remember one point, before probably I started in graduate school at Harvard, he was explaining the problem of the day, which was the missing zinc problem. Where was this extra carbon going? He said, what you really want to do is you want to measure oxygen.
So the inspiration really came from him?
It came from him. It definitely came from him. Now, I didn't think right then I'm going to go off and do this. That was just percolating in the back of my mind for a couple years. But then I came to Harvard and looked around at things, and I was initially thinking I wanted to be a theorist. I liked physics. I liked pure theory. I was excited by the elegance of the math. Somehow my undergraduate experience was very full of doing wonderful little problem solving, and I liked that. But as I came to Harvard, I started to wonder whether that's really what I wanted to do. And I spent, after coming for a quarter, I actually left to join my father in Switzerland on a sabbatical where I worked in a lab. And I really enjoyed it. And I came back to Harvard thinking, I want to do something that's more connected with everyday lives of people and somehow more hands-on. And so I was inspired to carve out some kind of future for myself doing experimental work.
So you chose a very difficult problem. In fact, at the time, a lot of people thought that measuring atmospheric oxygen to the kind of precision that was required to address this question was impossible. And so at what point did you actually, in working through it, at what point did you actually know that it was going to work?
Well, I always knew it was possible. I mean, you can always measure something better and better. It was a question of whether it was doable in the time frame of a PhD by a single graduate student.
Which you almost pushed the limits on.
Yeah. So that was the big issue. No, I was already interested in, as part of my physics interest was moving in the direction of making really precise measurements. I was intrigued with anything that could be measured out to 6 or 7 digits. Somehow I was thinking, wow, that's cool. Kind of esoteric, but it was a sort of, there was an elegance to it that I liked. And I realized, okay, here's a great problem in earth science. How to take all you had to do was measure this thing really well, and you had gold in your hand. You had something really valuable. So I started thinking about methods that have been used to measure things precisely in physics, and realized, okay, this is an approach that actually might carry right over.
The laser interferometry.
Yeah, it's an interferometer, which was being used at that time, for example, to effectively to measure the speed of light by using time standards that had certain wavelengths to length standards that had. And so and they were comparing lengths to 9, 10 significant figures at that point, which I thought was just astonishing, that you could actually hit a ruler that was that good.
So you knew in principle that it would work, but there must have been a kind of an aha moment when you actually were able to make the measurement or knew you'd be able to do it.
Yeah, it came more gradually than that, because it sort of it chipped away at it. It kind of worked okay, but not as good as I wanted it to for a little while. It was drifting. There was also lots of strategizing. How am I going to do this? And actually, I built the instrument. I designed the instrument with the idea that it was going to be used in a particular way. And once I built it, I realized there was a better way to use it. And then I also, as I said, confronted this problem that it was drifting, and I didn't understand why. And I was very lucky to have a fantastic group to work in under Professor Jim Anderson. Just really talented people. There was an engineer there who had built interferometers. He wasn't doing that then, but
he had experience.
He had experience. So Nate Hazen was his name. He took me downstairs because he realized I was stumped, or at least up against it, and I was sort of spinning my wheels. And we went down there, and I just saw how he approached it. He just played with the thing. He poked it here and poked it there, and what's sensitive here? And it became pretty clear after a while that there was something wrong with the windows. He put his hands on the windows, and it really went crazy. So just very tactile approach to troubleshooting.
You know, sometimes when you first start working with instrumentation, at least in my
Yeah.
experience, you're afraid to touch things. And,
Yeah, yeah.
and you have to get over that fear and start just rolling up your sleeves and getting your hands dirty.
No, it was wisdom that I've used many times with my own students. To say, what's wrong? Okay, let's figure out what's making this behave like it does. Let's just not be shy and jump in and push it around.
And sometimes there's surprises.
Yeah, you really learn fast that way.
Yeah. So, what did your dad think? Do you remember what he said when you made the first set of measurements, and it was actually clear that you had succeeded in measuring atmospheric oxygen, and we're going to be able to solve this problem of the missing carbon? Do you remember any particular conversation with your dad, or was he kind of involved the whole way along?
He was very hands-off the whole way along. He didn't particularly encourage me to go into the problem. There was other people who were starting to think about this, who'd already spent a little time on it, working with methods that didn't pan out quite as well. And his first reaction was, oh, so-and-so's already doing that. So it wasn't exactly brand new when I jumped in on it. There were other people discussing it, but it hadn't really gotten much serious investment. It was clearly a problem where there was room for a couple people to take a crack at it. So I think he was a little bit, I don't know, uneasy, perhaps might be the word, that I was jumping in on something that someone else was already doing that might be hard, and he was seeing the competitive side of it, perhaps, and I don't know. It was, but
He didn't realize that you were just as much of a bulldog as he was.
he probably knew me pretty well. I don't know. I don't know exactly how he would have framed my personality in his words, but I mean, like him, after a while I was having fun. I mean, I had fun thinking through how to do this and work on it, and I was very much on my own in the sense that I didn't have a partner in any close way to share my ups and downs with. Some days, there were all these milestones where this is the first time you try something, and is it gonna? Now, I remember going to the lab thinking, well, what happens today is going to determine whether I'm going to get out of here in 1 year or in 6 years. That's a lot of leverage on your life.
Yeah.
And you don't know going in what it's going to be. And actually, most of those things turned out pretty well, but I was still here a long time.
You were still here a long time, but it was time well spent.
It was a great time.
So here we are now, more than 25 years after you first demonstrated this instrument.
Yeah.
And we have a long record of atmospheric oxygen.
Right.
And, and the CO2. And we know from a much longer record of CO2 from your dad's lifetime of work that the airborne fraction, this amount of CO2 from fossil fuels that stays in the air, has actually been remarkably constant.
Right.
And when you think about all the complexities that we learn now from atmospheric oxygen, from your work, about terrestrial uptake and ocean uptake, and how complicated each of them are, and how variable they should be, it's kind of remarkable that fraction, that airborne fraction, has been so steady.
Yeah, it's really hung in there.
Do you think it's just a coincidence, and do you think it's going to persist?
I don't think it can possibly persist. So it's a consequence, in part, of our having lived in the last few decades through an era where fossil fuel burning was increasing at a sort of steady rate. The puzzle is that it stayed constant, this fraction, even though fossil fuel burning wasn't completely constant. It did change in its annual growth rate over this period, and it's a puzzle that you don't see that reflected as a shift in the airborne fraction.
Because the terrestrial biosphere and the ocean, they're responding to the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, not to the amount we're putting in every year.
Exactly. The sinks are seeing the loading of the atmosphere. They're not seeing our emissions directly. So why would those things appear to be so closely tied? It's got to be partly a coincidence of factors that have conspired to make it work that way.
Right.
And I don't expect it to last. And I have to say that, looking at the carbon balance, one of the things I was eager to see turn out one way or another was the evolution of the land sink of carbon, because the land sink always had a kind of a mysterious status. It wasn't exactly understood why it was happening, and it was always a little bit of a trade-off between knowing that we were emitting here and then there had to be some compensating sink to make up for it. And so its existence depended on this differencing that carried a lot of uncertainty. So you could almost wash the thing off and say, maybe it isn't that important. And what I was interested in seeing is what's going to happen with this missing sink. If it diminishes, maybe it wasn't really there at all as our measurements get better. But as our measurements get better, what happened is that it became more and more clear that it was real. So my own thinking about the carbon system has evolved over this period from thinking, maybe the ocean's going to be the main thing and the land would be a minor role, and now to my thinking, no, the land really deserves an important place in this discussion.
You know, the uncertainty about the land persists to today. So, if you look at models, for example, of carbon uptake, the ocean models, there's a little variability between them, but they mostly agree to first order. They're pretty consistent, showing a stabilizing of the sink. It's not going to continue to increase at the rate, and so it will plateau at some point, and that'll of course mean that if we keep burning fossil fuels, atmospheric CO2 will go up faster in the atmosphere. But it's going to plateau around 4 to 6 gigatons of uptake a year, and then persist there for a very, very long time. If you look at the models for the terrestrial sink, they're all over the place. Some of them produce a source by mid to end of the century. Some say that the sink is going to get much, much bigger.
Right. I mean, the difference is that the ocean sink is driven mostly by physics and chemistry, and the land sink is driven by biology. So which is easier to predict? How trees are going to behave in 100 years? What's going to be going on with forests after they've been dosed with high CO2 and they have had a warming environment going on? It's really hard to know. That the plants may be shifting directions. There may be different species springing up in the mix that are already there. There's so many possibilities, and that's why it's tough. And then what does the warming do? It makes the plants grow more. It also may cause the soil to decompose, which actually reverses the effect of storing carbon. Or dry out, yeah. So there's really quite a wide range of
not to mention what people are going to do on the land in terms of
and of course
how many
it's
trees
sitting,
they'll cut down for growing food or growing fuels.
It's sitting there as a resource or in the way of the soil that you want to use for growing crops. So, I mean, the humans have been sort of waging war on forests for thousands of years, and we're probably going to keep doing that.
When you take Dave Keeling and Ralph Keeling's work together as a family, what it's taught us is that we know that fossil fuel burning is giving rise to the rise in atmospheric CO2, and that the decline in oxygen tells us that the Earth system is actually giving us a little bit of a cushion. Only about 60% of the CO2 that we burn from fossil fuels is actually ending up in the air, and that residual 40%, about half of it's going into the land in photosynthesis in trees, and half of it's going into the ocean. Now, the question we could ask is, what's going to happen to those carbon sinks in the future? Can we actually count on that cushion going forward? It's sort of an amazing thing. The airborne fraction, what we call the fraction of fossil fuel combustion that ends up in the atmosphere, has been remarkably constant over the last several decades. There's been very little change. That's kind of surprising. There's no reason that you would expect that the ocean uptake of carbon or the terrestrial uptake of carbon would actually scale with the amount of carbon dioxide we add to the atmosphere. You would expect that it would vary based on the actual CO2 concentration, but not necessarily how fast we're putting it in. But it turns out it's actually remarkably constant. Going forward, it's not clear that it will be. There's a variety of efforts over the last many years to try to understand how the ocean and how the land will continue to take up carbon going forward and how reliable that will be. This slide shows the estimates from a variety of ocean and terrestrial models for how carbon dioxide uptake into the ocean and into the land will occur over the next century. It includes both the effects of carbon dioxide fertilization in land plants and changes in ocean chemistry and acidification of the ocean that we'll talk about later on, but also the effects of climate on these systems, how changes in aridity, changes in temperature will affect the growth of plants on land, the respiration in soils, and of course also the mixing of the oceans. Most oceanographers expect that the rate of ocean uptake of carbon will continue to increase, but it will start to plateau over time, saturating at about 4 or 5 billion tons of carbon per year. And that means that if emissions continue to grow, the airborne fraction will continue to rise. The main reason for this actually has to do with stratification of the ocean, but also the fact that you've already mixed it into the surface and intermediate depths of the ocean, and the remaining reservoir is the very deep ocean, and that takes a lot longer to mix. So the very fast mixed portions of the ocean are essentially closer to equilibrating with the atmosphere, and the deeper parts just take a long time. And so the ocean will persist in taking up carbon for thousands of years, but unfortunately, it can't do it fast enough because you're limited by the mixing into the deep ocean. And that's a physical process. It's very hard to change. It's driven by the rotation of the Earth. It's driven by tides, and those are difficult things to move. On the terrestrial side, it's much more complicated. Terrestrial ecologists have built large carbon cycle models to try to predict how climate change will affect the carbon cycle and how they'll respond to carbon dioxide. And in fact, the results are all over the map. Some models think that the terrestrial biosphere will continue to take up carbon as CO2 fertilization continues, and in a warmer climate, perhaps plants will grow faster. A lot of this, of course, depends on the availability of water. And they actually have the terrestrial biosphere taking up as much as 8 or 9 billion tons of carbon by the end of the century. On the other hand, some models think that it'll actually turn around, that in fact changes in water aridity, for example, in the Amazon, might actually lead to a huge net source of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And instead of taking up carbon, it'll actually start to release carbon to the atmosphere. This may be especially true if you consider the role of soils, especially the permafrost in high latitudes, where there's a huge amount of carbon, somewhere between 500 and 800 billion tons of carbon, frozen in soils that is right now immobile because the bacteria can't use it because it's frozen. If that starts to thaw, and we know it is thawing slowly, as those tundra soils thaw, bacteria will go to work and rapidly respire that organic carbon and turn it into carbon dioxide and release it to the atmosphere. And if that happens quickly, you could see a turnaround this century and have several gigatons of net source to the atmosphere. And of course, that's sort of like losing control, where we're no longer actually controlling the carbon cycle with our own activities. We've essentially pulled the cork out on the bottle, and the tundra is slowly releasing that carbon dioxide, or maybe not so slowly.